Hello again. This week we're going to follow on from what we were looking at last week, and this time we'll be looking at another kind of clause from ones we've been concentrating on. This is the interrogative clauses. Consider these two sentences: we should hide versus should we hide. Now, obviously these are very different sentences. One of them is a declarative, the first one makes a statement, and the other one is an interrogative, it asks a question. But at the same time as these differences, you can see that these sentences are similar, at least they are related to each other in some way. Should we hide, as a question, is asking about the content of the declarative sentence, we should hide. We call this a particular kind of question called a yes-no question, because the answer to the question is either going to be yes or no. And the reason for that is that the question is asking about the truth of the related declarative sentence. So should we hide is actually asking the question, is the statement we should hide true or not? Okay, so it's fairly clear then that although the interrogative sentence is a different sentence to the declarative, it's somehow related to the declarative clause. And in fact, syntactically, they're also quite similar in as much as that they're made up of the same elements. The only difference is to do with the ordering of those elements. Now, the traditional term for what's going on in the interrogative is known as subject auxiliary inversion. The idea is that we are inverting the order of the auxiliary verb should and the subject, in this case we. And that name itself indicates that the traditional view of these types of sentences is such that the interrogative is related to the declarative, because what we're doing is we are inverting the order of the subject and the auxiliary from its normal order that we see in the declarative. Furthermore, it's also suggesting that it's the declarative order which is the basic one, and that the interrogative order is the one that is formed on the basis of that by inverting these two elements. So this is the traditional view of this, and in fact it's the view that we're actually going to be following up, only in a bit more technical sense. Okay, so we will make the assumption that declarative orders are somehow basic, and the interrogative orders are what we call derived from the basic declarative order by some syntactic process. We'll get into that in a minute, but obviously with subject auxiliary inversion, we seem to then be assuming that what's going on here is that something is moving about. We are changing the order from the declarative subject auxiliary order to the interrogative auxiliary subject order. Now, if you think about it, there are a number of things that could possibly going on here to change that order. One thing we could do is take the subject and move it to some position behind the auxiliary verb, lower down into the structure closer to the VP. Alternatively, we could assume that what's happening is that the modal auxiliary verb, which is in the inflection position, as we know, is moving out of that position into a position somewhere towards the front of the sentence, in front of the subject. Now, the original name, subject auxiliary inversion, appears to suggest that what is going on here is that the two elements are moving one around the other. Actually, this is a notion that we're not going to entertain here on the basis of something called Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a guiding principle for doing science, and it says don't go for any more complicated solutions than you absolutely need to. So given that there are simpler possible ways of producing the relevant word order that we have here, i.e. moving one thing, not two, then we will assume that something that what's going on here is that one of these elements is moving and not both of them. Okay. In fact, when we start to look at it, the evidence is overwhelmingly that what's going on here is that it's the modal auxiliary which is moving to the front end of the sentence, not the subject which is moving backwards. We'll see more on that as we go on. The question, however, that arises once we assume that what's going on here is that the inflection is moving to some position at the front of the sentence is, well, what is that position? We might refer to this position as the landing site for the movement. So elements that move out of some position, they move into some other position. So the question we're asking here is, what is the landing site of this inversion movement? Before we get to that question, we need to look at some more facts about inversion that will tell us more about the process that's actually involved. Consider this sentence here, which is more complicated than the one we saw before because this one involves an embedded clause. John will think we should hide. So we should hide, it is embedded in a larger clause. John will think we should hide. Now, because there are two clauses, there are two inflections. Okay, and if inflection inversion or subject auxiliary inversion is a movement of the inflection to the beginning of the clause, then given that we've got two inflections here, we might think that there's a possibility of two different types of movement. But turns out that that's not true. In fact, the only grammatical way of forming a yes-no question from this sentence is to move the first auxiliary and get will John think we should hide, not moving the second auxiliary, getting should John will think we hide, okay, which is obviously ungrammatical. What we can conclude from this then is that the movements involved in these kinds of processes are restricted. You can't just do anything with a movement. In particular, if you're going to move something, you should move the one that is closest to the landing position. In other words, movements are local. They can only move from one place to a nearby position, or they're short. Another observation about inversion is that we can get inversion, apparently, in embedded clauses. But when we do, it's different from what we might expect. Consider these two sentences. John might ask, should we hide? And John might ask if we should hide. Now note, there's a similarity here. The embedded clauses are both have the status of yes-no questions, and in fact that's exactly what an if clause is. An if clause is an embedded yes-no question. But we've also got the possibility here, apparently, of inverting the auxiliary in the embedded clause too and getting the first sentence. John might ask, should we hide? But if you think about it, these two sentences are very different from each other. They actually mean something quite different. In the first case, we've got John might ask, should we hide? Where should we hide is naming what John actually said when he asked it. Okay, whereas John might ask if we should hide names the content of the sentence that John uttered when he asked it. Okay, so in the first case, we've actually got the statement that John said, should we hide? That's what he actually said. Whereas in the second one, we don't exactly know the words that John used to ask this particular question. He might have said, is it necessary that we secrete ourselves in the cupboard? And then he asked, should we hide? So the first one actually tells us the words that John used when he asked this question, and the second one tells us the content of the question he actually uttered. So there's a very big difference here, and that falls down to the fact that ask is an ambiguous type of verb. It's something which we refer to as a performative verb, or it can be a performative verb. That is a verb that by actually uttering it, you perform some sort of linguistic action. Okay, so to ask something is to utter a particular form of a sentence, which is an interrogative, a question. Asking is also a non-performative verb in as much as it can just be reporting the content of a question. So you can ask a question, and what we're looking at there is the content of what was actually asked. And in the first case here, we're obviously using the verb ask in its performative sense. John might ask, should we hide? That is, he might utter these words, which are a question. In the second instance, we're looking more at the contentful part of ask, that asking is a question, and this is the content of the question that was asked. Now, we refer to the first case then as direct speech. Okay, so the embedded clause says that this was something that was actually said. The second case is of indirect speech. We're saying this is the content of what was actually said rather than these are the actual words. Direct speech reports something that was actually said. So when these words were uttered, should we hide, clearly they were a main clause themselves. Okay, you don't speak in embedded clauses. So what John actually said when he said it, should we hide, that was a main clause. So actually an embedded direct speech sentence has an ambiguous status. It's sort of embedded inside another sentence, but it's actually reporting something that wasn't embedded. It was reporting a main sentence when it was actually said. The other kind, the if type sentence here, is clearly an embedded clause. It never was a main clause. It couldn't have been a main clause because main clauses don't begin with complementizers. So the if clause is clearly an embedded clause, whereas the direct speech one has a kind of an ambiguous status. Is it embedded clause? Is it a main clause? Well, it looks as though it's a main clause because it involves an inversion, and we get inversion in main clauses. That would then lead us to the conclusion that what's actually going on in the embedded clause is that real embedded clauses don't have inversion. They have the if form of the interrogative. Okay, and we can actually demonstrate this if we see what happens if we take a verb that isn't like ask and has these two interpretations, a performative and a non-performative interpretation. For example, the verb to know is something that can only be non-performative. If you know something, you're not performing any linguistic action, you're not asking a question or making a promise or something like that. You just know it. And note, with know, you can't get a direct speech complement of it. You can't say John might know, should we hide? Why can't you know that? Well, because that's what this is saying, is that John knows this sentence, these words in this order, which is a main clause, and that you can't have. You can have, however, John might know if we should hide. So know is a verb that can take an interrogative complement clause, and in particular a yes-no type one. But that has to be formed using an if type sentence, not with an inversion type sentence. Okay, so know is a verb that takes a purely embedded clause, and the fact that the embedded clause has to be with the complementizer, not with the inversion, leads us to the conclusion then that inversion only takes place in a main clause, never in an embedded clause. And where it looks as though it's happening in an embedded clause, that clause has this ambiguous status and really is a main clause in disguise as an embedded clause. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the landing site of the inversion. Okay, we know that the movement has to be short, and it's something that only takes place in a main clause. Well, here's the main clause as we know it. From last week we said all clauses are CPs, so there is a CP built on top of an IP. The IP has all of the normal things in it. It has a subject in its specifier position, has the head inflection, which could be a modal auxiliary like it is here, or a tense, and then in the complement position we have the VP. Okay. Now, when we get inversion, that inflection element moves out of its inflection position into a position in front of the subject. Now, it's fairly clear, I think, by looking at the structure we've got here, that the place it seems to move to is precisely to the complementizer position. That is a position in front of the subject. Main clauses don't fill that complementizer position with an overt complementizer, so it looks as though what we could do is move the inflection into that position too. So our analysis of these interrogative clauses involving inversion is movement of the inflectional element into the complementizer position. Now, there are a number of advantages of this actual analysis. First of all, note, because what you're doing is moving a word from a head position into another head position, nothing actually changes about the structure that we've got here. All we've done is we've taken one head and put it into another head position. So what we've got here is head-to-head movement, and that involves no absolute radical change of the structure. So that's another way in which we might see that movements are restricted. We've seen movements are restricted in that they have to be short or local type things. Well, it may be the case that movements are even more restricted than that, and that they're not allowed to change the structure too radically. Furthermore, it makes sense that an inversion, being a kind of interrogative type of sentence, it makes sense that that should involve the complementizer and the complementizer phrase in general, because that's exactly what the complementizer's job is. Remember from last week, the complementizer is the thing responsible for determining the difference between interrogative and declarative clauses. So it makes perfect sense then that if we got a process involved in forming an interrogative clause, that process is going to involve the complementizer phrase and the complementizer head specifically. So this analysis seems to work. The question is, do we have any direct evidence other than these theoretical considerations that we've looked at here? Is there any direct evidence that this is actually what is going on? Well, if you think about it, if inversion is a movement that moves an inflection into the complementizer position, then it should be the case that complementizers and inverted auxiliaries are in complementary distribution, because when you've got a complementizer there, there's something filling that position and you're not going to be able to move the auxiliary into it. And when you move the auxiliary, you can't have a complementizer there as well. So you can't have two elements in the same position. So if inversion is movement to the complementizer position, we expect there to be no complementizer. The problem with this, however, is that the facts seem to gang up against us finding the actual evidence we need. And that's because of two facts that we already know. Firstly, there are no overt complementizers appear in main clauses. Okay, so you never get an overt complementizer in a main clause. On the other hand, there's no inversion in embedded clauses where there are complementizers. So it will be true that an inversion happens where you can't find a complementizer, i.e. a main clause, and it won't happen where you can find a complementizer, i.e. in embedded clauses. But those two observations may have nothing to do with the movement of the inverted auxiliary into the complementizer position. There may be completely independent explanations for why these things are true. So therefore, the fact that these two observations are true leads us into a position where we can't actually show that complementizers and inverted auxiliaries are in complementary distribution because they occupy the same position. They're in complementary distribution, but for other reasons. Fortunately, however, there is a construction which can either make use of a complementizer or an inverted auxiliary. And this is known as the conditional clause. Okay, a conditional clause is a clause that sets out a condition for the main clause to be true or not. For example, if I had been there, I would have stopped it from happening, or something like that. So the if I had been there is the condition on which I would have stopped it happening being true. Note, this is formed with an if complementizer. It's not a question. This is just another function of the if complementizer. It can introduce conditional clauses. On the other hand, the other version here, had I been there, clearly involves an inversion. Here we've got the auxiliary had being inverted with the subject put in front of the clause, in front of the I there. Therefore, there is no other reason why you couldn't have both of these things. So if the two occupy the same position, we predict that they should be in complementary distribution. If they don't occupy the same position, then we predict that you should be able to have both of them together. What's the facts? Well, the fact is it's impossible to have both the inverted auxiliary and the if complementizer. You can't say if had I been there, or even had if I been there. Okay, so the evidence is that the two are in complementary distribution, and the complementary distribution here can only be explained by the assumption that they are occupying the same position. Therefore, we've got direct evidence here that inversion is movement to the C position. Before we go on any further, it's worth whilst at this stage taking a step back and looking at some more general consequences of the analysis that we're proposing here. In particular, the fact that we're using this notion of a movement. Now, what that means is that for every sentence, there are two ways of describing its structure. The kind of structure that you get before anything moves and the kind of structure you get after movement. So there are two different levels, as it were, of description of the structure of any sentence. And those two levels are precisely what are connected by this movement process. Okay. Now, it's important to realize that what is not being claimed here is that we take one sentence and we move things around to form another sentence. The process that we're talking about here doesn't change sentences to sentences. It changes underlying structures of a sentence into the more surface version of the structure of that sentence. So for every sentence, there are two levels of structural description. To separate these, we call them different names. The kind of structure you get prior to the movement happening, we call it a D structure. The kind of structure that you get after the movement is called an S structure. And D structures and S structures are of different natures. They're related to each other by movement. So you form the S structure by operating a movement process on a D structure. D structures themselves are what are directly formed from the kinds of things we've been considering up until now. They're formed from lexical elements and their properties, and the X-bar principles that tell us how those things can be combined. So X-bar theory feeds directly into D structure. So all D structures conform to X-bar theory, and they conform to the lexical requirements of the elements that are inserted into them. Movement comes along, and we've noticed that movements are short and they don't change things radically. In other words, S structures also are going to conform to X-bar theory because the movements that happen are not allowed to change that. Movement, we say, is a preserving process. Okay, movement preserves two things. First of all, it preserves the structure. Furthermore, It doesn't change lexical properties. So a movement doesn't change, say, for example, the category of an element. That's important for what we're talking about here, because when the inflection moves out of the inflection position into the complementizer position, it doesn't become a complementizer. It's still an inflection. It's just occupying a different position. The categories are determined at D structure. Okay, so D structure is the place where categories are inserted into the structure, and once they're there, movement can't alter that. What we've been looking at so far is cases of inversion where we have an auxiliary verb. Okay, but as we know, the inflection position doesn't have to be filled by a modal auxiliary. It can also be filled by a tense, and then we don't have an auxiliary verb. All we have is the subject and the verb, and the inflection itself is more abstract there. So we have we hid. Now, what the structure of this is, as we know, is we've got this abstract past element in the inflection position. Okay, the subject and the verb phrase are the same. Now, if we're going to apply inversion to this, well, the prediction is going to be that whatever it is that's in the inflection position is going to move to the complementizer position. So presumably what's going to happen here is that the past element is going to move into the complementizer position. That seems a bit strange, but if we actually look at what does happen, we can see that actually this isn't too far off as a prediction. What we actually get in such sentences, if we want to turn a D structure where there's no actual modal auxiliary into an S structure involving inversion, we get something that actually represents the tense before the subject. So we get did we hide? Now that word do, or did in this sense, is basically expressing nothing more than tense. It's past tense. Okay, if it had been a present tense sentence, we hide, then we would get a present tense form of the do at the front. It would do we hide. Okay, so it seems then that exactly what we predicted is actually happening. We're moving the tense element from the inflection position into the complementizer position. And the result of that is we get this form did come out. Note there's another consequence as well, which can be seen in terms of the form of the verb to hide. Okay, in the first case, we hid, we get the past tense form of the verb. In the second one, where we've actually moved the past tense away from the verb, we get the untensed version of the verb hide. So we can really see here that the past tense is moving away from the verb so that the verb somehow is not affected by the tense anymore. What we actually do then is to insert this verb do. Do is often, in this particular usage of it, referred to as a dummy auxiliary. What that means is it performs no semantic function at all. It doesn't add anything to the meaning of this sentence. It performs purely a syntactic purpose or a morphological purpose, and that is to act as the thing that supports the past tense morpheme. So when we move the past tense morpheme from the inflection position into the complementizer position, we need to insert this dummy auxiliary do to support it and allow it to be bound by something or other. Okay, let's move on now to look at different questions other than yes/no questions. There's the one that we can see here, who can you see, is something that is often referred to as an information interrogative, because rather than asking a yes/no question which requires yes or no, it requires an answer to give you some information. So who can you see requires an answer about who is the person such that you can see them. We also call these kinds of sentences WH questions because they all involve these WH phrases like who, which, what, why, where, how, etc., etc. Not just those interrogative pronouns, which are DPs, but also things that can be larger than that. So you can say whose mother or which picture. So that's a WH question. This is what they look like. Notice also that there is inversion here. The auxiliary verb can is in front of the subject, so that has moved out of the inflection position into the complementizer position. Okay, now the other thing to notice here is that we're using the verb to see, and see here is a transitive verb. Transitive verbs are the kinds of verbs that have objects. But in the WH question, who can you see, you don't see the object there. There's no object in the position following the verb, like you would in a declarative clause. You can see some DP, somebody. Okay. More worrying or more puzzling is the fact that in a WH question you can't actually give a transitive verb an object. You can't say, who can you see, Bill? Okay. Now, if a transitive verb is something that requires an object, the fact that you can't give it an object is quite a puzzling observation. Of course, it's not all that puzzling because it's fairly clear what's going on here. The verb see actually does have an object. That object is the WH phrase, who. Okay, and you can see that clearly because the WH question, who can you see, relates in the same way that we've seen questions and declarative clauses are related. That question relates to the declarative, you can see somebody. Okay, so the question is, tell me the identity of that somebody such that you can see them. All right, so the who actually is the object of see, and therefore the reason why you can't say who can you see, Bill, is there you've got actually two objects of the verb see, and see can only take one object. Okay, so with that observation, then, we can see that WH questions seem to involve another kind of a movement, because the object of the verb doesn't appear in the object position, it appears somewhere else at the front end of the sentence. And that would appear to suggest that the object has moved out of its original position at D structure into a new position at S structure. Okay. So this is the original structure. I don't know what that DP is doing up there, but it's supposed to be down there next to the C. Okay, so we've got an inversion happened. Can you see somebody or other? All right. But what we're doing is we're replacing that DP with a who. Okay, so the original form of this whole thing is you can see who. Remember I said D structures are not always grammatical S structures, so you can see who isn't the grammatical S structure for this sentence, but it is the grammatical D structure for the sentence, with who in the object position, can in the inflection position, you in the subject position, and see in the verb position. That's exactly what you would expect following X bar. Then things move. The inflection moves to the C position, and clearly the who moves to a position in front of the inflection. So now the question is, where is that position? Where does the WH phrase move to? Well, looking at the structure, you can see that all of the positions inside the CP are mostly taken. The complementizer position is already filled, so the who can't be moving to the complementizer position. Besides, that wouldn't be a good movement because the who is a phrase and the complementizer position is a word position, a head position. And if you moved a phrase into a word position, that would radically change the structure, and movements aren't allowed to do that apparently. So it doesn't move into the complementizer position. The subject position is already filled, and besides, the subject position is too low down. The who must move further out than that. There's only one position in this structure that the who could possibly move to, and that is the specifier position of the CP. That's a good position for it to move to, because a specifier position is a phrasal position, and we're moving a phrase here. So we're moving a phrase into a phrasal position. We're not changing the structure. Moreover, so far we haven't seen what goes into the specifier of the CP. The assumption that WH phrases move to the specifier of the CP therefore gives us an answer to the question, what occupies the specifier of the CP? It's moved WH phrases that go there. So the analysis then of moving a WH phrase from some position inside the IP into the specifier of the CP seems to work well. With that then, let's compare what we've said about the phrases that form clauses and DP. As we've predicted, they all have exactly the same structures. They all have the same structural possibilities. They're all headed by words. They all have phrases in their complement positions and phrases in their specifier positions. Okay. The difference is in terms of what the head is. If the head is an inflection, you're going to get an inflection phrase. If the head's a determiner, you're going to get a determiner phrase. If the head's a complementizer, you're going to get a complementizer phrase. Moreover, those heads place restrictions on what their complements can be. Okay. In each case, the complement of the different heads is restricted to a single type of complement. Inflections always take VP complements, determiners always take NP complements, and complementizers always take IP complements, never anything else. So in that sense, these are all very similar kinds of structures. The specifier positions get filled by different elements, which have different roles. So in the IP, the specifier position is filled by a phrase which is has the role of the subject. The one thing that we know about the subject and its inflection is that they can, under the right circumstances, enter into what's known as an agreement relationship. That is, specifically in English, if the subject is third person singular, then the inflection will be the third person in singular inflection. That is the s inflection. So we get John knows as opposed to I know and you know and we know. So when they've got the s version of the inflection, then it's a third person singular subject. That sharing of features is what we call agreement. And exactly the same thing happens in the DP, because if you have a possessor, then you must have a possessive determiner. You've got to have the s determiner. So John's dog. Okay. When there's no possessor, you can't have the possessive determiner. You can't just say dog. Okay. So you must have a non-possessive determiner like the dog or a dog or some dog or something like that. And that shows us that the specifier, the possessor, and the determiner, the head, enter into an agreement relationship. When there is a possessor, there must be a possessive determiner. When there's no possessor, there must be a non-possessive determiner. Exactly the same thing goes on inside the CP too. How do we know that? Well, when you've got a WH phrase in the specifier of a CP, that clause is going to be interrogative, therefore marked with the feature plus WH. Remember, plus WH is interrogative, minus WH is declarative. So when you've got a WH phrase in the specifier of the CP, the whole clause is plus WH. What that must mean is that the head of that clause must be plus WH, because it's the head that determines the nature of the clause. And therefore, clearly, the head is in agreement with the specifier, because a WH phrase is clearly an interrogative phrase, therefore it's plus WH, being interrogative. So with a plus WH specifier, we get a plus WH complementizer. So in all of these phrases then, we have restrictive relationship between the head and its complement, and an agreement relationship between the head and its specifier. Again, as we predict, the whole pattern is the same throughout. Okay, let's just summarize the main points that we've said in this presentation. First of all, the CP plays a central role in interrogatives. It acts as the landing site for two movements which are specifically involved in creating interrogative clauses, that is, inverted auxiliaries, which move to the head position, the C position, and WH phrases in WH interrogatives, which move to the specifier of the CP. Okay, this isn't at all surprising given that complementizers themselves clearly play a role in determining interrogative declarative distinctions. So the fact that the whole CP is involved in the kinds of syntactic processes used to form interrogatives is not at all surprising. More generally, we've talked about this notions that enter into the grammar once we introduce another kind of process. Up until now, we haven't looked at this process of movement. We've just been looking at structures as being rather static things. However, it seems that we need to introduce this more dynamic approach to syntax where things change in structures, things move from one position to another. And we've seen that that leads us to the conclusion that there are these two levels of structural representation for every sentence. A D structure, which represents the structure of that sentence before things move, and an S structure that represents the structure after the movement. The D structure is directly formed using the X bar principles, putting in lexical elements into the relevant relationship. Okay, so D structure comes directly from X bar and the lexicon. S structure is then formed, or well, another word for that is to derive. Okay, so S structure is derived from D structure via movements. Those movements, as we've seen, are restricted. You can't just do anything with a movement. Movements have to be short, and movements have to be preserving. They can't change things radically. The only things that they can do is move elements from one position where it's possible to get them, i.e. a head in a head position or a phrase in a phrase position, into another position that X bar allows elements to appear. So heads move to head positions, phrases move to phrase positions. Okay, that's everything that I have to say in this presentation, so I'll see you in class. Bye.